The sterile hum of the Deep Space Observatory was a constant companion, a lullaby of machinery that usually soothed me. Tonight, it felt like a low thrumming in my skull, a subtle vibration against the quiet. I was alone, as I preferred to be, nestled in the heart of this isolated facility, surrounded by banks of glowing monitors and the silent, patient work of distant antennae sifting through the cosmos. My coffee, long cold, sat untouched beside a stack of printouts detailing spectral analyses. Weeks blurred into a single, focused effort, an obsession really with a specific patch of sky. It was a region colloquially known as the Great Void, a vast, seemingly empty gulf between superclusters, a cosmic desert where the density of galaxies plummeted to almost nothing. A truly blank canvas. That's what made it so fascinating, a true null hypothesis. Most of my colleagues thought it was a waste of resources, chasing ghosts in the cosmic vacuum. But there was a stubbornness in me, a belief that even emptiness held secrets. My eyes scanned the latest data stream, a cascade of numbers and graphs scrolling across the primary display. A familiar flatness, a predictable baseline, confirmed the expected null readings. Nothing. Just the faint background radiation, the cosmic static of the universe's birth. I leaned back in my chair, stretching the stiffness from my shoulders, a sigh escaping me. Another night, another confirmation of nothing, then a flicker. It was so subtle, so brief, I almost dismissed it as a glitch in the display panel. A single sharp peak on the spectral graph, a sudden impossible burst of organized energy. It wasn't broadband noise, not the chaotic signature of a distant quasar, nor the rhythmic pulse of a pulsar. This was different, too clean, too precise. My breath hitched. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the console, my grip tight. I scrubbed the data back, replaying the last 10 seconds. There it was again, a fleeting spike, then gone. It was a single, non-repeating event. My mind immediately jumped to possibilities: internal interference, a stray cosmic ray hitting the detector, a software anomaly. The array was cutting edge, but even the best equipment could hiccup. I ran a diagnostic on the primary receiver, cross-referenced the auxiliary sensors. All green. No red flags, no system errors. I isolated the signal's coordinates, pinpointing its origin, still that impossibly empty region. Impossible, I muttered, the word feeling dry in my throat. I tried to replicate the conditions, adjusting the array's focus, narrowing the aperture, straining for another glimpse. My scientific training screamed false positive. My instincts, however, were beginning to prickle. There was an unsettling quality to that spike, something that felt deliberate. I spent the next hour meticulously re-examining the data, running filtering algorithms, trying to strip away any potential noise. Each pass, the spike persisted, unwavering in its impossible clarity. It wasn't random. It wasn't a blip. It was a signal, but from what? From where? My hands trembled slightly as I pulled up the comprehensive log. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could delete it, attribute it to an unidentifiable error, and move on. No one would ever know. No one would question me. It would be the rational, scientific choice. My career, my reputation rested on concrete, verifiable data. This was anything but. But the image of that sharp, solitary peak kept replaying in my mind, a ghost in the machine. It was like a single, perfectly formed word whispered into the deafening roar of a waterfall. It shouldn't exist, the sheer impossibility of it. The observatory, usually a sanctuary of logic and order, seemed to shift around me. The hum of the machinery deepened, almost vibrating in my bones. The air grew heavy, thick with a smell of salt and decay I couldn't place. My vision blurred for a split second and the sterile control room warped, replaced by a suffocating gray. I was somewhere else. The air was thick with a cloying, briny fog, so dense I could barely see my outstretched hand. Water slapped against metal, a rhythmic, unsettling sound. The low growl of unseen engines vibrated beneath my feet, a powerful thrum that promised motion, yet there was no sense of movement. Just the rocking, the ceaseless creak of straining steel. The vastness of the fog seemed to press in, suffocating, yet I felt an even greater emptiness. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful clang of a loose chain somewhere in the impenetrable mist. I stood on a cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running. The engines groaned, a mechanical lament, but no one was at the helm. No one was anywhere. I was utterly, terribly alone in that gray shroud, the metallic tang of fear rising in my throat. Then just as suddenly the image dissolved. I gasped, clutching the console, my heart racing. The smell of salt was gone. The low hum of the observatory was normal again. Had I dozed off, hallucinated? It felt too real to be a dream. This wasn't normal. The pressure of the last few months, the isolation, it was getting to me. That had to be it, stress. And the signal. The signal was still there, logged in the system's buffer, waiting for a decision. My rational mind tried to dismiss both the vision and the data, but a nagging, insidious tendril of curiosity, mingled now with a profound unease, refused to let go. I typed in the command. The system accepted the entry with its usual indifferent chirp. It was there now, a permanent record of the impossible. I sat back, the chair groaning under my weight, and stared at the empty patch of the screen where the signal had briefly manifested. My skin felt clammy. The low hum of the observatory no longer felt soothing. It felt like a vibration from something vast and unseen, just beyond the veil of my comprehension. What had I just invited into my carefully constructed world of facts and figures? I was alone, as I preferred to be, nestled in the heart of this isolated facility, surrounded by the intricate silence of deep space, relayed through humming servers. My fingers danced across the holographic interfaces, pulling up the raw data, the impossible anomaly. It was a faint ripple at first, a ghost in the cosmic background noise I'd been sifting through for months. My initial instinct was to flag it as an instrumentation error, a stray cosmic ray, or perhaps some obscure interstellar dust cloud interfering with the sensors. The universe was full of static after all. My colleague, the data analyst, would have dismissed it without a second thought. But something in its persistence, its subtle, almost imperceptible consistency over the past few hours, held my attention. I isolated the signal, stripping away layers of interference, filtering out galactic chatter and solar flares. What remained wasn't a clean, distinct waveform. It was a chaotic symphony of frequencies, a blizzard of data points that should have resolved into white noise. Yet, as I zoomed in, then zoomed further, a strange, almost crystalline structure began to emerge from the chaos. It wasn't a repeating pattern in the traditional sense, no simple sine wave or binary pulse. Instead, it felt like a fractal, infinitely complex, revealing new depths of order the closer I looked, but never quite repeating itself. My brow furrowed. This defied every known principle of natural emission. Stars didn't sing like this. Nebulae didn't hum with such intricate self-similar complexity. Hours bled into each other. My coffee grew cold, then warm again from the ambient heat of the equipment racks. My eyes ached, but I couldn't pull away. I ran every algorithm I had, every statistical analysis tool in the observatory's arsenal. I looked for mathematical sequences, for prime number patterns, for any indication of an underlying code. Nothing. It wasn't a cipher I understood. It wasn't a language. It wasn't even energy in a form I recognized. It didn't decay predictably. It didn't fluctuate randomly. A new sense of unease began to prickle at the back of my neck. The signal wasn't just complex. It was intelligently complex, not intelligent in a human way or even an organic way. More like the way a snowflake is complex but with an underlying intention. No, not a snowflake. More like a colossal, intricate machine designed by a mind utterly alien, operating on principles utterly unknown. It was too organized to be random, too dynamic to be static, too present to be an illusion. I found myself leaning closer to the holographic display, as if proximity would reveal its secret. My breath hitched. Was it communicating? Was it simply existing? The sheer audacity of its presence, emanating from a region of space declared utterly empty, was a slap in the face to everything I thought I knew. The universe wasn't just silent and vast, it was vast and listening. Or worse, it was vast and speaking, and I was only now picking up its incomprehensible murmur. I spent the next few days in a blur, my world shrinking to the confines of my workstation and the flickering light of the signal display. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Food was an afterthought. The requests from the operations chief for my weekly report went unanswered. A colleague, the systems engineer, stopped by my console, asking if I needed a break, if I was all right. I mumbled something about a critical data review, my eyes still fixed on the shimmering patterns. He hesitated, then left, his footsteps receding down the corridor, leaving me once again in the comforting, yet now ominous hum of the machinery. My isolation, once a preference, was becoming a necessity. I couldn't articulate what I was seeing. Not yet. They wouldn't understand. They'd label it anomalous, then dismiss it. I knew better. The signal was subtly changing now, not in its fundamental structure, but in its cadence. It felt like it was responding to my observation, or perhaps just continuing an unknowable dialogue with itself, completely indifferent to my existence. The air in the control room grew thick, heavy. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that seeped into my temples. My head throbbed. I closed my eyes for a moment, just a second of reprieve from the glowing screens. When I opened them again, the sterile walls of the observatory were gone. The hum of the servers was replaced by the groaning of stressed metal, the churning of unseen machinery. A dense, cloying fog pressed in from all sides, so thick I could taste the salt and damp on my tongue. I was standing on a rusted deck, the metal slick beneath my worn shoes. Around me, looming shapes materialized and dissolved in the mist. Cargo containers stacked impossibly high, their numbers faded, their paint peeling. The rhythmic thrumming I now felt wasn't in my skull, but beneath my feet, a deep, powerful vibration resonating through the entire vessel. It was the unmistakable pulse of immense engines running, but there was no one. The deck was empty, save for me. A cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My eyes darted around, searching for an edge, a seam in this terrifying illusion. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the vision dissolved. I was back in the control room, my hands gripping the edge of my console, gripped tight. The familiar hum of the observatory filled my ears, but it no longer soothed. My heart hammered against my ribs. My skin was clammy. Had I drifted off? Was I hallucinating from exhaustion? The memory was too vivid, too tactile. The smell of brine, the vibration of the deck, the crushing solitude. It felt like a warning, a glimpse into a reality I was not meant to see. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. It was calling to me, drawing me in, unspooling itself layer by impossible layer. My determination solidified, hardening into something akin to obsession. I wouldn't stop. I couldn't. What else would it show me? What deeper truths lay hidden in its silent, intelligent hum? My eyes snapped open, not to the familiar console lights, but to a dim, grimy ceiling. The low thrumming was still there, but it wasn't the observatory's ventilation anymore. It was deeper, a resonant vibration that permeated the very deck beneath my feet. A metallic tang, like rust and stale seawater, assaulted my nostrils. My breath hitched. I wasn't in the observatory. I pushed myself up, my muscles protesting, a dull ache blooming in my temples. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and a pervasive, oily smell. Around me, steel bulkheads, painted a faded industrial gray, stretched into a gloom only partially pierced by the weak, flickering glow of an emergency light strip. Through a porthole, a milky, impenetrable wall of fog pressed against the glass, swallowing the world outside. A cargo ship. I was on a cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, yet strangely a part of me felt no surprise. As if this shift, this impossible displacement, was merely an expected progression. The ship groaned. a mournful sound that seemed to echo the emptiness surrounding me. My hand went to my chest, feeling the frantic flutter of my heart. Where was everyone? A chill, damp and profound, seeped into my bones, unrelated to the ambient temperature. The engines thrummed below, a deep, persistent pulse, an almost organic rhythm that vibrated up through the deck plates and into my very marrow. It felt like the ship itself was breathing, a colossal, blind leviathan adrift in a shroud. I stumbled out of what must have been a small cabin, the corridor outside a maze of identical steel walls. The emergency lights pulsed erratically, casting dancing shadows that stretched and contracted like grasping fingers. Each flicker was accompanied by a subtle pop that felt less like an electrical short and more like a tiny rupture in the fabric of the air itself. My comms device, usually a steadfast companion, was dead weight in my pocket. I pulled it out, its screen a blank, unresponsive slate. I tried the ship's internal comms panel nearby. Just dead, all of them. The thrumming intensified, or perhaps it was just my perception sharpening. It wasn't uniform anymore. There were variations, subtle shifts in pitch, like a monstrous, submerged choir humming a single, sustained note, occasionally modulating into something else, something wrong. I heard a distinct, wet slosh from somewhere deeper within the ship, not the sound of water in the hull, but something heavier, thicker, sliding. My stomach churned. Then I saw it, a brief shimmering distortion in the air ahead near the end of the corridor. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the mundane, grimy bulkhead. My breath hitched, a strangled sound in my throat. My hands were trembling, clammy with a sudden, profound sweat. They was the signal doing this. They was it leaking into my vision, twisting reality at the edges. I moved cautiously, drawn by an instinct I couldn't explain. The bridge. I had to find the bridge. The ship's internal layout felt both alien and disturbingly familiar, as if I had walked these corridors before in a dream. Each step on the metal deck echoed, the sound unnaturally crisp, then swallowed by the pervasive hum. I passed the galley pots and pans still hanging but coated in a fine layer of dust, a half-eaten meal decaying on a table, frozen in time. No sign of struggle, just absence. My eyes snagged on a small, locked cabinet in what looked like the captain's quarters, adjacent to the bridge. It seemed out of place, an old wooden chest incongruously bolted to the steel wall, adorned with tarnished brass fittings. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor emanated from it, a resonance that seemed to answer the thrumming of the engines. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I forced the latch with a heavy wrench I found discarded nearby. The wood groaned, then splintered with a sharp crack. Inside, nestled among yellowed nautical charts and a sextant, were not logbooks but a collection of ancient leather-bound tomes. Their pages were brittle, smelling of dust and forgotten ages. The script was archaic, a mix of Latin and something else, a serpentine script I dimly recognized from obscure historical linguistics papers I'd once dismissed as fringe. The text detailed symptoms, electronic failures, shifts in ambient sound, fleeting visions of impossible geometries. My own experiences laid bare in these crumbling pages. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, not from the engines but from somewhere above me. It was a sound too deep for any animal, too organic for machinery. It was like the ship itself was clearing its throat, preparing to speak. My eyes darted to the ceiling, then to the porthole, where the fog seemed to swirl with an unnatural intensity, almost coalescing into indistinct forms. Was the ship just a vessel, or was it a conduit for something that had been waiting? A metallic tang like rust and stale seawater filled my nostrils. My head ached, a dull throb behind my temples, and my limbs felt heavy, as if I'd been sleeping in a cramped space for far too long. I pushed myself up, my muscles protesting, and found myself on a narrow cot, bolted to a bulkhead. The air was cold, damp. I was in a small, windowless cabin. A single bare bulb cast a sickly yellow glow on chipped paint and peeling linoleum. The thrumming of engines was relentless, a bass pulse that vibrated through the soles of my worn shoes. I stumbled to the door, my hand finding a cold brass handle. It opened with a groan. A narrow corridor stretched before me, dimly lit, smelling of diesel and brine. This was no observatory. This was a cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running. The realization settled heavy in my gut, a leaden anchor in an ocean of confusion. Where was everyone? Where was I? I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Every door I passed was closed, sealed, or slightly ajar to reveal empty, disused cabins. The silence was profound, broken only by the ceaseless thrum of the engines and the drip of condensation somewhere nearby. I found a ladder leading to a higher deck. As I ascended, the metallic tang grew sharper, mingled with the cloying dampness of the fog. When I pushed open the hatch, the world outside was a swirling, opaque gray. Thick fog pressed in from all sides, swallowing the horizon, muffling all sound. The ship's horn, a deep, mournful bellow, pierced the shroud every few minutes, a lonely cry swallowed almost immediately by the endless vapor. There was no land in sight, no other vessels, just the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. I walked to the bridge, pushing open a heavy, watertight door. The console lights were on, glowing faintly, but the captain's chair was empty. No one. Just the gentle rocking of the ship, the steady thrum, and the omnipresent fog. My mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible. One moment, the observatory. The next, this. I must have collapsed from exhaustion, or perhaps the sheer strangeness of it all simply overwhelmed me. Sleep, when it came, was not a release. It was an immersion, the signal. My dreams dissolved into a maelstrom of impossible sensation. I wasn't seeing images, I was experiencing them. Geometries that twisted and folded in on themselves, lines that were simultaneously straight and curved, shapes that defied the very concept of dimension. Colors pulsed with an intensity that burned behind my eyelids, hues I had no names for, colors that felt ancient and wrong. They weren't just visual, they were textural, tasting of cold metal and distant void, smelling of ozone and something vast and indifferent. And then the presence. Not a being, not a creature with form or intent, but a crushing awareness of something immense. It was the feeling of being a single dust mote in a galaxy, a momentary flicker against an eternity of slumbering cosmic indifference. It was a pressure, like the deepest ocean, pressing in on my consciousness, threatening to flatten it into nothingness. There was no malice, no anger, only an incomprehensible scale that made my human mind reel, trying to grasp what it could not. My body felt like it was dissolving, my bones turning to dust, my flesh to vapor, all while still impossibly anchored to the cot. I was screaming, but no sound escaped my throat. My breath hitched in my throat, ragged and shallow. The cabin was exactly as I had left it, dim and cramped, the engine's thrum a familiar, if unsettling, constant. But the metallic tang in the air now felt different, sharper, as if the dream had left a residue, a faint echo of its impossible chemistry. My head throbbed, not just behind my temples, but deeper in the very core of my brain. I ran a trembling hand over my face, feeling the clammy skin. Was that real? Was any of this real? The cargo ship, the fog, the missing crew, the dream. It all felt like a carefully constructed illusion, designed to pry open the fragile seams of my sanity. I tried to rationalize. Stress, exhaustion, maybe some unknown gas leak on the ship affecting my perception. But the details of the dream, the experience of it, were too vivid, too alien. This felt like a direct transmission, bypassing my instruments, bypassing my eyes, going straight into the raw processing power of my mind. I stumbled out of the cabin, needing air, needing clarity. The ship's horn sounded, a low moan, and I flinched, my nerves frayed. Then it happened. Not a dream this time, not a vision. It was a ripple. The fog in front of me shimmered, not like heat haze, but like a fabric being subtly distorted. For a fraction of a second, the swirling vapor seemed to part, revealing not the ocean beyond, but a glimpse of those impossible geometries. A lattice of lines that didn't obey perspective, a flash of those nameless colors, burning with an internal light. It was there and gone, faster than thought, leaving only a lingering afterimage that stung my eyes. My breath caught in my chest. My hands gripped the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. My stomach churned, a sudden nausea rising in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, forcing myself to look. Nothing. Just the endless, featureless gray. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was bleeding into the physical world, or rather, twisting my perception of it. It was tearing at the fabric of my sight, my hearing, my very thoughts. What would it show me next? And more terrifyingly, what would be left of me when it was done? A metallic tang like rust and stale seawater clawed at the back of my throat. My head ached, a dull, insistent throb behind my eyes. I pushed myself up, my muscles stiff, protesting with every movement. The air was heavy, damp, tasting of salt, and something else, something metallic and faintly putrid. I was in a narrow bunk, the kind I'd find in a ship's quarters. A small, round porthole, thick with condensation, offered only a milky view of swirling gray. Fog. A deep, mournful bellow split the silence, a sound that vibrated through my bones, a foghorn. I scrambled out of the bunk, my bare feet hitting cold, slick metal. I remembered the phrase, though I couldn't for the life of me recall how I knew it or why I was here. My last clear memory was the hum of the signal, the frantic scribbling in my notebook, the growing certainty that what I was hearing wasn't just data. It was a voice. I had tried to explain it. I had needed to. "It's not an anomaly, Professor," I'd insisted, my voice raspy from sleepless nights, my fingers tracing frantic patterns on the holographic display. We were in the cramped, fluorescent-lit meeting room, the stale coffee smell doing little to cut through my rising anxiety. The senior researcher, a man whose patience was as legendary as his grants, simply steepled his fingers, his gaze unblinking. "Raj, we've reviewed your data. The signal-to-noise ratio is negligible. You're seeing patterns where there are none. But the periodicity, the complexity." I gestured wildly at the screen where my own visualizations, vibrant and chaotic, pulsed like a living thing. "It adapts. It learns. It's communicating." A colleague whose desk was usually meticulously organized shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "Raj, you haven't slept in days. Your analysis is highly subjective. We're concerned." Concern, that was the polite word for it. Disbelief was closer. Dismissal, closer still. I tried to make them understand the profound, terrifying implications of what I was hearing. I spoke of the way it felt, the way it subtly twisted my perception of the familiar, making the observatory walls seem to breathe, the very air thicken with unspoken weight. My descriptions grew less scientific, more visceral, more desperate. I must have sounded mad, a sentience, older than stars, and it's awake. The room had gone silent. The senior researcher slowly pushed his chair back. My access codes were revoked. My project funding frozen. My reputation, meticulously built over years, crumbled into dust. They spoke of stress, of burnout, of a needed sabbatical. I knew it was ostracization. They had dismissed me, but the signal hadn't. It persisted, weaving through my thoughts, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of my consciousness. Without the observatory's equipment, I was deaf, but not entirely blind. The presence had already begun to subtly recalibrate my inner ear, my inner eye. I could feel it. I needed answers, something beyond the sterile confines of accepted science. If the universe they knew couldn't contain what I had found, then I would look to the forgotten corners. My search became a frantic, solitary pilgrimage through the forgotten and the forbidden. I devoured ancient texts bound in decaying leather, their pages brittle with age and neglect. The air in those places was thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet, like withered flowers. I found fragmented accounts, unsettling poems, and cryptic warnings not of aliens or advanced technology, but of things that existed outside the familiar spectrum of reality, entities that predated the very concept of time. There were mentions of dreaming architects whose slumber held existence together, of a veil separating our reality from a terrifying other space. One faded drawing, depicting a monstrous formless mass with an impossible geometry, made my breath catch. Its description spoke of a cosmic hunger and a silent, crushing pressure on the minds of those who perceived it. Not explicit descriptions of frequencies or wavelengths, but of the effect of such entities. The way they unraveled sanity, the way they made the familiar alien, the way they imposed a profound, unsettling wrongness on everything they touched. These texts weren't scientific, but they offered a framework, a terrible, ancient lexicon for the incomprehensible. They spoke of truths that were never meant to be known, of a reality far vaster and more hostile than any human mind could ever grasp. My head throbbed again, pulling me back to the present. The cargo ship groaned, a deep metallic sigh as it rode an unseen swell. The fog outside the porthole remained impenetrable, a thick gray wall. Why was I here? What part of my desperate search had led me to this desolate vessel, adrift and abandoned? And what forbidden truth might be waiting for me in the heart of this spectral fog? The silence on the cargo ship was a living thing, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the low, throbbing pulse of the idling engines somewhere deep below me. I felt it more than heard it, a resonant hum that vibrated up through the deck plates and into the soles of my worn boots. Fog, an endless, swirling white curtain, pressed in from all sides, swallowing the horizon, blurring the line between sea and sky. This was my new office, a cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running. My former colleagues, the senior researcher, they'd called me many things in those final, damning meetings. Obsessed, delusional, unprofessional, but never wrong. They hadn't seen what I'd seen, hadn't felt the impossible cold of that signal. Now, adrift here with nothing but a jury-rigged antenna, a repurposed server, and a laptop humming on a makeshift desk in what must have once been the captain's quarters, I was free from their pitying stares and their dismissive scientific consensus. The air here smelled of salt, damp metal, and something else, a faint, acrid tang that might have been old diesel, or perhaps just the loneliness of a vessel abandoned. I'd spent days on this ship, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate need to prove myself right, to understand. After my access was revoked, my funding frozen, my reputation meticulously dismantled, this ship was the only place I could truly work, truly listen. I'd salvaged what I could, scrounged for parts, and now, finally, after endless iterations of algorithms, after countless dead ends, I felt a flicker, a resonance. The screen, a beacon in the dim, fog-filtered light, displayed the raw, chaotic data stream. It was a cacophony of patterns, a symphony of noise that hinted at an underlying structure, like static clinging to a perfect melody. I'd been trying to filter it to find a key, a Rosetta Stone for something that defied all known linguistics. My previous attempts had focused on mathematical symmetries, on cosmic constants, on every terrestrial and theoretical framework I knew. They had all failed. But what if it wasn't a language to be translated? What if it was something else entirely? I leaned back, my chair groaning under my weight. The ship swayed gently, a barely perceptible roll that reminded me of its isolation. The low thrum of the engines was a constant, unsettling companion. I looked out the smeared porthole, seeing only the impenetrable gray. Was I truly alone out here? A new approach had been forming in my mind, a desperate, almost intuitive leap. I decided to stop trying to force the signal into a human comprehensible structure. Instead, I would try to let it structure me. I began to modify my filtering algorithms, not to simplify the noise, but to allow for its inherent alien complexity. I wasn't looking for patterns I understood. I was looking for the absence of patterns I understood, a negative space that might reveal its true form. Hours bled into one another. My eyes burned. My stomach gnawed, but I couldn't stop. A faint shimmer appeared on the screen, a subtle shift in the chaotic lattice of data. It wasn't a clear image, not a sound, but a feeling of coherence, like disparate threads suddenly weaving into a single, impossible fabric. I punched in a final sequence, a last, desperate gamble based on a gut feeling that had no scientific basis. The screen flickered. The chaotic patterns didn't vanish, but they suddenly aligned. They rearranged themselves, not into symbols, but into shifting, impossible geometric forms that pulsed with colors I had no names for. They were beyond the visible spectrum, yet I could see them, raw and vibrant, searing themselves into my retinas. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the ship, deeper than the engines. It wasn't sound in the traditional sense, but a pressure in my chest, a dull ache behind my eyes. My hands started to tremble, not from fear yet, but from a profound, primal sense of wrongness. Then it began. The images on the screen weren't images. They were concepts. They flooded my mind, bypassing my eyes, my ears, my very understanding of language. It was a direct download, a flood of pure, unadulterated knowing. First, the scale. Not the scale of stars or galaxies or even superclusters. It was a scale that rendered all of those things as trivial as motes of dust dancing in a sunbeam. My entire understanding of the cosmos, built on decades of study, crumbled. The universe wasn't a vast, expanding canvas of matter and energy. It was a single, infinitesimal ripple on the surface of something else. Something ancient, something colossal. Then the life, not life as I knew it, not organic, not even inorganic in any sense I could grasp. These were entities woven from reality itself, existing in dimensions that folded back on themselves, in states of being that defied all physical laws. They were not active, not awake, not aware in a way I could comprehend. They simply were, and they were everywhere, slumbering, dreaming, and their dreams were our reality. My stomach lurched. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, overwhelming impossibility of it all, less than a fleeting thought. We were an accidental byproduct, a momentary eddy in the vast, slow current of their incomprehensible existence. We were utterly, perfectly insignificant. My fingers, still hovering over the keyboard, felt numb, disconnected from my will. I tried to pull back, to close the program, to break the connection, but the concepts had already rooted themselves deep within my mind. They weren't just data anymore. They were a part of me, reshaping my perception of everything. What had I truly deciphered? And what now was deciphering me? The silence on the cargo ship, adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running, was a living thing, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the low, throbbing pulse of the idling engine somewhere deep below me. Fog, an endless, swirling shroud, swallowed the horizon, pressing in on the vessel, blurring the line between the sea and the sky. I hadn't seen the sun in days, perhaps weeks. Time had become a meaningless construct, a flimsy human invention that no longer applied to me. My fingers, raw and calloused, traced the faint, glowing lines on the makeshift display I had cobbled together. The signal. It was no longer a series of abstract patterns or complex mathematical anomalies. It was a language, a vast, patient whisper that had seeped into the marrow of my bones. I had found its cadence, its terrifying grammar, and in doing so I had undone myself. Sleep had become a foreign country, a place I could no longer visit. My reflection in the grimy porthole glass showed a stranger, gaunt and pale, with a brittle intensity in his gaze that was unsettling even to me. Every muscle ached, a persistent thrumming beneath my skin, a low-frequency vibration that mirrored the ship's engines. I hadn't eaten much, the thought of food a distant, unappealing concept. All that mattered was the signal, its endless, unfolding truth. The world I once knew, the one filled with petty concerns and human interactions, felt like a faded photograph, distant and irrelevant. The missing crew, the baffling abandonment of this massive vessel, these details, once pressing, now barely registered. What did a few absent individuals matter when the very framework of existence was being peeled back, layer by agonizing layer? The first distortions had been subtle, easy to dismiss as fatigue or the trick of the fog. I'd blamed the lack of sleep, the strain on my eyes, the constant hum of the engines playing tricks on my ears. But they grew bolder, more insistent. Yesterday, I had been standing on the bridge, staring out into the featureless gray expanse, when the fog itself seemed to coalesce. Not into a solid form, but into an absence, a shape defined by what wasn't there. Now the distortions were almost constant. The very structure of the cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running, felt fluid. I'd catch myself sniffing the air, searching for the source of these phantom stenches, only to find the familiar maritime smells. The deciphered knowledge wasn't a set of facts or equations. It was an understanding, a profound, terrifying awareness that seeped directly into my consciousness. It spoke of scale, of an existence so vast that our universe was but a fleeting thought within its greater dream. It hinted at architects, not of stars or galaxies, but of the very laws that govern them, slumbering entities whose awareness stretched across cosmic epochs, indifferent to the rise and fall of civilizations. It was simply beyond our spectrum, beyond our capacity to perceive, teeming with an existence that dwarfed our understanding of life itself. The spaces between stars, the vast gulfs once considered barren, were merely the gaps in our own perception, the blind spots in our limited reality. And these entities, these true architects, were not malevolent in any human sense. They were simply there, an ocean of incomprehensible awareness, utterly alien, utterly indifferent. We were less than dust motes to them, less than the microscopic organisms that drifted unseen in the fog outside. My own thoughts, once so clear and precise, now felt like echoes of a greater mind, distorted reflections of a truth too vast for human comprehension. I found myself humming a low, tuneless melody that wasn't my own, a resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the ship, a counterpoint to the engine's thrum. It was a melody of utter desolation, of endless, patient waiting. For a long moment, the solid steel seemed to waver, its metallic sheen replaced by a dull, fleshy texture. It pulsed slowly, subtly, like a vein beneath skin before solidifying back into unyielding metal. My breath hitched. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't imagination. This was real. The signal had not just revealed a truth, it had carved a new window in my mind, allowing me to glimpse the true, horrifying reality that lay just beyond the veil of our limited senses. The world was not what I thought it was. It was a flimsy illusion, a thin veneer over something else, something vast and ancient and utterly beyond human grasp. And I was seeing it now, the cracks forming, the true nature of things bleeding through. What else would this new vision reveal? I felt it more than heard it, a resonant hum that vibrated up through the deck plates and into my bones, a constant reminder of the mechanical heart beating beneath my feet. The fog outside pressed against the portholes, a gray, wet shroud that swallowed the horizon and blurred the line between the vessel and the empty world. I was alone, truly alone, adrift in a milky void, my only companions the hum and the persistent, impossible signal. My portable equipment, salvaged from my lab and hastily reassembled in the ship's cramped navigation room, glowed with an unnerving array of indicators. The main display, usually a cacophony of cosmic background noise, now showed only a single, impossibly precise waveform. It wasn't just data anymore. It was directed. I saw it in the subtle shifts in amplitude, the deliberate variations in frequency that had once seemed random, mere statistical anomalies. Now, I perceived a pattern, an intentionality that made the hair on my arm stand on end. It wasn't just out there. It was for me. The thought was absurd, megalomaniacal even, but it resonated with a truth I couldn't deny. All my life I'd sought patterns, connections, the hidden logic of the cosmos. The signal wasn't simply emanating, it was beckoning. Each pulse was a soft, insistent tug, a silent invitation to step closer, to peer beyond the veil of what I understood. My fingers trembled as I adjusted a dial, fine-tuning the receiver. The hum from the ship's engine seemed to intensify, vibrating not just through the deck, but through my very skull. I felt a growing pressure behind my eyes, a subtle ache that hinted at something deeper than fatigue. This wasn't merely intellectual curiosity anymore. It was an urge, a primal, undeniable draw. The source wasn't just a point in space. It was a hungry mouth, and I felt myself leaning in, compelled to offer something of myself to its vast, unseen maw. The risk, I knew, was immense. My colleagues, if they were here, would call it madness, a grand delusion, but they hadn't heard what I heard. They hadn't felt the subtle, persistent pull. Their warnings, their dismissals, felt like distant echoes from a world I no longer inhabited. My world was here on this ship with this signal. I began to sketch out a new circuit diagram on a greasy napkin, my pen scratching furiously. The idea had been forming for days, a dangerous escalation of my original setup. Standard amplification techniques wouldn't be enough. I needed something resonant, something that didn't just boost the signal but intertwined with it, allowed it to flow through me to become me. It was a crude, desperate concept, cobbled together from theoretical physics and a terrifying intuition, designed to bypass the usual filters of perception, to break down the barrier between observer and observed. My breath hitched. The air in the navigation room grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and damp metal. I was building a bridge, not just for data but for consciousness, a direct conduit, and I, Raj, was answering. I worked with a frantic intensity, soldering wires, adjusting components, my hands moving with an almost alien precision. The ship swayed gently, a cradle in the endless gray, but I barely noticed. My entire being was focused on this singular, terrifying task. I repurposed a high-frequency transmitter, usually reserved for long-range distress calls, to act as a kind of feedback loop, designed to resonate with the specific, impossibly ancient frequency of the signal. It was a wild gamble, a deliberate short circuit of my own neural pathways, designed to achieve a direct, unfiltered communion. The potential for mental collapse, for permanent dissociation, was not lost on me. It felt less like a risk and more like an inevitability, a necessary sacrifice. My fingers brushed against a bare wire and a sharp, stinging shock jolted through me. I barely registered the pain. My focus remained fixed on the array of glowing lights, the humming components, the pulsing waveform on the screen. The device I was assembling wasn't just a receiver, it was an invitation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the crude apparatus was complete. Wires snaked across the console, connecting my original setup to the modified transmitter, creating a tangled web of potential. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the master switch. The hum of the ship's engines throbbed louder, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to synchronize with my own frantic heartbeat. The air crackled with a static charge. This wasn't just about understanding anymore. It was about merging. Was I truly ready to step across that threshold? Was I truly prepared for what might greet me on the other side? I pressed the switch. A low, whining sound filled the room, growing in intensity, a sound that seemed to come not from the speakers, but from within my own head. My vision blurred, the world around me distorted, shimmering at the edges. What would I see when the connection was complete? The low, throbbing pulse of the idling engines somewhere deep below me vibrated up through the deck plates and into my bones, a dull ache that resonated in my teeth. I stood on the main deck of the cargo ship, adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running, the chill dampness seeping into my jacket. The air tasted of salt and something else, a metallic tang, like distant lightning or the smell of old, forgotten machinery. The fog pressed in, a silent, swirling shroud that swallowed the horizon and muted the already muted glow of the emergency lights. My breath plumed white, a fleeting ghost in the gloom. I had brought my equipment, the specialized signal processors and amplifiers, and connected them to the ship's own vast array of sensors, hoping the sheer scale of the vessel would provide the necessary conduit. A foolish hope, perhaps, but what else was left? The signal had grown bolder, more insistent, no longer a faint whisper from the void but a resonant hum in my own skull. It felt like a tuning fork vibrating against my inner ear, seeking a frequency only I could perceive. I had to know. I needed to know. My fingers, stiff with cold, brushed against the cold metal of the console I'd jury-rigged in the empty bridge. They were the visual representation of the signal, a language without words, a structure without form. I watched them, my eyes aching from the strain, waiting for the anomaly, the break in the pattern, the moment of truth. What would it reveal? Then the hum intensified. It wasn't just in my bones now, but deep within my chest, a pressure building behind my sternum. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. The fog outside the bridge windows seemed to press even closer, morphing into indistinct shapes that writhed at the edges of my vision. My temples throbbed, a dull, rhythmic pain that mirrored the pulse of the ship's engines. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, a metallic taste coating my tongue. Was it the ship, or was it me? The patterns on the screens began to shift, to coalesce. They no longer looked like mere waveforms. They were intricate, impossibly complex fractals that folded in on themselves, revealing new layers of detail with each passing moment. My mind struggled to process the sheer volume of information, the recursive geometry that seemed to defy the very laws of perception. It wasn't just visual. I felt the patterns, a cool, smooth pressure against my skin, a soft vibration in my teeth. It was as if the signal was no longer an external phenomenon, but something woven directly into the fabric of my own senses. A sense of immense scale washed over me, not of distance, but of depth. It was as though the universe itself had peeled back a layer, revealing the impossibly intricate machinery beneath. My breath hitched. I gripped the edge of the console, my grip tight, my fingers trembling. This wasn't a signal anymore. It was an unveiling. What was I seeing? What was I becoming a part of? The patterns on the screen dissolved, replaced by something far more profound, something that bypassed my eyes entirely and imprinted itself directly onto my consciousness. It wasn't a shape. It wasn't a creature. It was a principle, a fundamental, underlying truth of existence, vast beyond any human comprehension of dimension or time. It was a lattice of interconnected concepts, a tapestry of logic so alien and perfect that my mind rebelled, trying to force it back into familiar categories. The form was not in the universe. It was the universe, or at least the true, raw, unfettered essence of it. It was a cosmic intelligence, not thinking in thoughts but being in patterns, endlessly unfolding, endlessly refining. My individual existence, my very consciousness, felt like a fleeting ripple on an ocean that spanned eternity. And then the purpose became clear, not through words, but through an overwhelming, crushing certainty that settled deep in my bones. This entity wasn't malicious, nor was it benevolent. It simply was. Its purpose was inherent to its nature, a slow, inevitable reshaping of reality. Not destruction, but a constant, subtle rearrangement of the fundamental elements of existence. The universe wasn't static. It was a living, breathing canvas upon which this intelligence was perpetually drawing, erasing, and redrawing. Humanity, with all its aspirations, its triumphs, its struggles, was less than a dust motes in its cosmic design. An ephemeral speck, an accidental pattern that might persist for a fleeting cosmic instant or be brushed away without a flicker of awareness. Our perception of time, our understanding of cause and effect, our very concept of life and death were quaint, localized fictions in the face of this vast, indifferent, eternal process. A wave of nausea swept over me, so potent it buckled my knees. My vision blurred at the edges, the emergency lights in the bridge elongating into streaks of sickly yellow. My lungs felt constricted, as if the air itself was too heavy, too thick to draw in. The universe had no grand plan for us. We were just part of the evolving pattern, capable of being rewoven or simply unraveled. The hum of the engines, which had become indistinguishable from the signal, returned to its dull throb. The intricate patterns on the screen were gone, replaced by the familiar, meaningless waveforms. The fog outside still pressed against the windows, but it no longer writhed. It was just fog. I stumbled back from the console, my legs refusing to support my weight, and collapsed into the cold metal chair. My head swam. My mind felt stretched thin, frayed at the edges, but irrevocably changed. I had seen the true form, and it had shown me the truth. The cargo ship, adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running, continued its silent drift, carrying me, a fragile vessel of consciousness, towards an unknown destination. What would happen when the reshaping reached us? My breath plumed white, then vanished into the thick gray shroud that swallowed the horizon, the masts, even the bow just meters ahead. It wasn't just fog anymore. It felt like a physical presence, a heavy, wet blanket pressing down, stealing the air. I leaned against the cold railing, my fingers tightening around the rust-pitted metal. The world beyond the ship had been a distant echo for days, a fading memory of order and sense. But something had shifted. The static on the ship's auxiliary radio, which I'd kept tuned to distant news bands, had taken on a new quality over the last few hours. It wasn't just white noise. It was a low, resonant hum beneath the crackle, almost like a vast, unseen choir humming off-key, just at the edge of hearing. It made the small hairs on my arms prickle. A faint, unnatural light began to bleed through the impenetrable fog above, a sickly, bruised purple that pulsed slowly like a dying heart. It wasn't the sun, not even a distant city glow. This was something internal to the fog itself, or perhaps to the sky behind the fog. I watched it for what felt like an hour, my gaze fixed on the shifting, spectral bruise. It intensified, then receded, then flared again, painting the dense vapor in hues that felt fundamentally wrong, an affront to the eye. My stomach churned. I remembered a garbled report I'd caught on the radio earlier, before the hum had truly taken hold. A city, hundreds of miles away, had experienced a sudden, inexplicable widespread power surge, not a blackout, but an overload. Lights had exploded, machines had seized. Another report from a coastal town spoke of people simply stopping, standing in the streets looking up at the sky, not moving, not speaking for hours. The anchor's voice had been tight, strained, trying to dismiss it as mass hysteria, but the tremor in his words betrayed him. He sounded afraid. We were all afraid. The purple light above pulsed again, stronger this time, and a low, guttural sound, like a tectonic plate groaning under immense pressure, rumbled from somewhere deep within the fog. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't the ship. It was vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. The sound resonated in my chest, a physical thump against my ribs. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it was already inside me, a vibration in my very bones. I wasn't just hearing reports anymore. I was feeling it. It was like a million individual anxieties, each a sharp pinprick, all coalescing into a single, crushing weight. I realized with a sickening jolt that the entity wasn't just subtly nudging my perception. It was using me as a conduit, a receiver for the world's unraveling. My head began to ache, a deep, throbbing pain behind my eyes. I stumbled away from the railing, pushing myself off the cold metal, my legs suddenly weak. The deck swayed beneath me, or perhaps it was me swaying. The air, already heavy with moisture, felt thick, viscous, like breathing liquid. I could taste something metallic, acrid on my tongue, even though there was no smell. The ship's engines below me, which had been a constant, reassuring thrum, suddenly faltered. Not a stop, but a stutter, a momentary catch in their rhythm, followed by a deeper, more resonant throb. The entire vessel shuddered, a long, drawn-out groan of metal stress that echoed through the empty corridors. The purple light above flared violently, turning the fog a deep, angry crimson for a split second, illuminating nothing but the endless, churning vapor. Then a new sound. A distant, faint chorus of screams carried on the impossible wind seemed to ripple through the fog. Not human screams, not exactly. They were too thin, too high-pitched, too layered, as if hundreds of voices were screaming the same impossible note simultaneously. It was a sound that didn't belong to this world, a sound that twisted the air itself. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it was useless. The world was crying out, and I was hearing every note of its agony. My breath plumed thinly in the frigid air, dissolving into the swirling mist as if it had never been. My brain, usually a precision instrument, felt like a bell that had been struck too many times, a dull ringing echoing behind my eyes. The fog was a living thing now, not just a meteorological phenomenon. It had a texture, a weight, pressing against my skin with an almost deliberate insistence. I blinked, trying to clear the haze from my vision, but the haze was external, an enveloping shroud that seemed to thicken with every passing moment. The ship's horn, which had been sounding a mournful, rhythmic blast for hours, suddenly wavered. It stretched, the deep bellow distorting into something impossibly long, drawn out, like a groan ripped from the throat of something far too large for sound. Then it cut out, abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the fog itself. I walked to the railing, my boots scraping on the wet metal deck. My hands, despite the gloves, felt numb as I gripped the corroded rail. The world outside the ship was a uniform gray, featureless, an absolute blank slate. But as I leaned closer, peering into the impossible density, I saw it. A ripple. Not a ripple in water, but a ripple through the air, through the very fabric of the fog itself. It wasn't a disturbance from a wave or a gust of wind. It was a distortion, a momentary bending of light that made the gray shift, revealing a fleeting glimpse of something else. Something that shouldn't be there. For a fraction of a second, the fog seemed to part, not to reveal the sea or sky, but a pattern. A lattice of lines, impossibly fine and intricate, woven together in a geometry that defied Euclidean space. The angles were wrong. Triangles had 4 sides, squares curled in upon themselves, and parallel lines converged and diverged at the same time. It was like looking at the underlying code of reality, briefly exposed and utterly, devastatingly alien. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The fog was back, uniform, opaque. Had I imagined it, or was my mind simply trying to repair the tear in what it understood as real? The engines below me began to change their rhythm. The steady thrum became erratic, a stuttering, gasping beat like a dying heart struggling for one more pump. The deck plates beneath my feet shuddered, not with the familiar vibration of machinery, but with an uneven, lurching motion that felt organic. The ship, once a solid construct of steel and rivets, seemed to flex and groan as if its very components were shifting, realigning under an unseen pressure. I felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of disorientation. The horizon, which I knew to be utterly obscured by the fog, nevertheless seemed to tilt, throwing my balance off. I stumbled back against a stack of crates, my shoulder hitting the rough wood with a dull thud. This wasn't just my perception unraveling, this was the world itself. The signal, the presence, it wasn't just observed anymore, it was acting. It was here. I looked up, scanning the invisible mast and the rigging lost in the mist. There was no wind, no sound but the dying cough of the engines. Yet a single rope, thick with brine and age, began to sway. Slowly at first, then faster, developing an impossible arc, describing a curve that seemed to extend beyond its physical length, stretching and contracting in defiance of gravity. My eyes tracked it, mesmerized and horrified. How could a rope move like that? Then came the sound. It wasn't a sound from the ship nor from the sea. It wasn't just hearing it. It was feeling it directly in my skull, in the marrow of my bones. It was the collective scream of consciousness, stretched thin, breaking apart. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was internal, an echo of something happening on a scale I couldn't comprehend. Was this what it meant for reality to bend, for minds to shatter? I scrambled towards the bridge, needing to see, to understand, to find some anchor in this dissolving world. The door, usually a heavy, solid slab of steel, felt strangely pliant beneath my touch, yielding with an unnatural give. Inside, the navigation instruments flickered erratically. The radar screen, a circular green glow, showed nothing but static, yet within the static, I saw those impossible geometries again, briefly, like a glitch in the very display of existence. Lines of light formed polyhedra that folded into themselves, dissolving and reforming in an instant. The compass needle spun wildly, then pointed straight down, burrowing into the binnacle as if trying to escape the magnetic field of this new, impossible Earth. My gaze fell upon the ship's logbook lying open on the chart table. The pages were damp, the ink blurred. The last entry, scrawled in a frantic hand, simply read, "It's not the fog. It's inside the fog, it's everywhere, we can't see it, but we feel it. The world is coming undone. The angles are wrong. And below that, a series of crude, childlike drawings. Shapes that were undeniably familiar yet utterly alien, twisting and merging, forming patterns that made my eyes ache to look at them. They were like the brief glimpse I'd had in the fog, but rendered with a terrified certainty. I could feel the ship itself, the massive steel hull, groaning under a stress that had nothing to do with waves or wind. It was a structural tension, as if the very atoms of the metal were being pulled apart, restitched into new configurations. I pressed my palm against the bulkhead. My mind reeled. Was the ship dissolving around me? Or was it reforming into something else entirely? My brain, usually a precision instrument, felt like a bell that had been struck too many times, its resonance now a chaotic, ringing cacophony. The sound of the ship's engines, a low, persistent thrum beneath my feet, seemed to vibrate not just through the steel hull, but directly into the bone of my skull, a rhythm that was both alien and unnervingly familiar. The fog was thick, a living shroud that pressed in from all sides, swallowing the distant horizon, the sky, even the rail of the ship a few feet away. It wasn't just water vapor, it was a presence, a heavy, silent witness. I could taste the salt in something else, something metallic and ancient on my tongue. My fingers, numb with cold, traced the rough texture of the railing, the chill biting deep. I closed my eyes, trying to reassemble the fragments of my thoughts, to find the anchor of my own identity amidst the swirling chaos. Raj, that was my name, the signal. It was still there, not a sound I heard with my ears, but a constant, insistent pressure behind my eyes, a language without words that bypassed all my rational filters. Now it was a roar within me, reshaping my very perception of reality. It didn't speak of stars or galaxies anymore. It spoke of beneath, of before. My eyes opened and the fog seemed to writhe, not with wind, but with an internal motion. The ship itself felt like it was breathing, its steel plates expanding and contracting with the engine's pulse. Was I truly on a cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running? Or was this merely the last, most stubborn illusion my mind clung to? The question didn't bring panic, but a strange, unsettling calm, a clarity that tasted of ash. I walked to the edge of the deck, my boots heavy on the wet metal. It felt like standing on the edge of a world ready to step into nothing. My breath still plumed, but it seemed to carry a different scent now, something sharp and mineral like crushed stone. The signal intensified. It wasn't just information anymore, it was an instruction, a reprogramming. I felt a strange tingling in my fingertips, spreading up my arms, a sensation not unlike pins and needles, but deeper, more profound. It felt like every cell in my body was waking up to a new frequency, vibrating in unison with something vast and unseen. My vision sharpened, but not in a way that brought clarity to the fog. Instead, I began to perceive contours, almost shapes, within the swirling mist that had no business being there. Not optical illusions, but fundamental shifts in the light, ripples in the fabric of what I'd always called space. A low groan, not from the ship, but from somewhere deeper, resonated through my chest. My own chest, or was it? The line between myself and the ship, between myself and the enveloping fog, began to blur. My skin felt taut, stretched, as if it were no longer quite my own. I reached out a hand, watching it as if it belonged to a stranger. The fingers seemed longer, the nails harder, catching the faint, diffuse light in an unnatural way. I flexed them. The movement felt both familiar and utterly alien. The transformation was subtle, insidious. It wasn't a sudden burst of light or a dramatic restructuring. It was a quiet dissolution, a reforming from the inside out. My thoughts weren't my own anymore, not entirely. They were intertwined with the signal, a vast, ancient consciousness bleeding into mine. The cosmic truth wasn't just something I was observing, it was becoming me. I was no longer Raj, the astrophysicist, struggling to comprehend. I was becoming a lens, a conduit, an aspect of the incomprehensible. I looked down at my reflection in a puddle of rainwater on the deck. The The face staring back was still mine, recognizably Raj, but the eyes, they were different, deeper, wider. The pupils seemed to drink in the light, expanding, shifting, reflecting the swirling fog not as a barrier but as a translucent veil. Behind it, I could almost see structures, geometric impossibilities that folded in on themselves, vast and indifferent. My mouth opened and a sound emerged. It wasn't a scream nor a sob. It was the sound of the signal made manifest, and it felt right. It felt like the truest thing I had ever uttered. My vocal cords, my lungs, my very bones were resonating with it, becoming part of its endless song. The concept of humanity began to recede, a distant shore I had already left behind. I understood now. I was no longer merely observing the new, alien reality. I was becoming a part of it, a worshipper perhaps, an avatar, or merely an irrevocably enlightened yet utterly broken observer. The dampness felt like a second skin. The engine's hum was my heartbeat, the fog was my breath. I had transcended, or perhaps I had merely been subsumed. What would I do now with this new understanding, this transformed existence? The cargo ship drifted, its engines running, carrying its silent, altered passenger into the heart of the unending mist. What new purpose awaited me beyond the veil? My brain, usually a precision instrument, felt like a bell that had been struck too many times, its resonance now a fractured, discordant clang. The world, or what I still stubbornly thought of as the world, seemed to be echoing that dissonance. The fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was too thick, too uniform, pressing in with a palpable weight that felt less like water vapor and more like congealed thought. It muted the thrum of the idling engines, turning the powerful machinery beneath me into a distant, rhythmic pulse, like a vast, unseen heart struggling against an immense pressure. I ran a gloved hand over the cold, slick railing, feeling the grit of salt and the strange, almost oily film that coated everything. The air tasted of brine and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust from a ship that had sailed before oceans even formed. My eyes, dry and aching from sleepless nights spent hunched over screens, strained into the swirling gray. Shapes formed and dissolved at the periphery of my vision, fleeting, geometric patterns that had no place in nature, then vanished before I could truly focus. Were they illusions born of exhaustion, or was the fog itself weaving them? A low moan, deep and guttural, seemed to vibrate up through the steel deck plates, not from the engines but from under the ship, or perhaps from the very water itself. It was a sound that made my teeth ache, a sound of immense, slow suffering. What was it lamenting? I moved towards the bow, each step a deliberate effort against the invisible resistance of the air. The ship pitched slightly, a gentle, almost imperceptible roll, yet it felt like the entire world was tilting on an axis I hadn't known existed. The horizon was gone, swallowed by the ceaseless, encroaching gray. There was no distinction between sea and sky, only an infinite, undifferentiated expanse of white. My sense of direction, my internal compass that always knew true north, spun wildly, then simply ceased to function. A faint light, a pulsating, sickly green, began to filter through the fog ahead. It wasn't a navigation buoy, too amorphous, too deep in its hue. It pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, matching the deep thrumming I now felt in my own chest. Each pulse seemed to draw the fog closer, making it swirl and coalesce around the light, like moths drawn to an unnatural flame. What was that terrible, inviting luminescence? I leaned against the railing, the cold metal biting into my forearms. The green light grew, revealing not a source, but an absence of obstruction. It was as if the fog itself thinned in that specific space, allowing something from beyond to bleed through. And as it grew, the metallic taste in the air sharpened, like iron filings on my tongue. My ears began to ring, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the engine's hum, replacing it with a sensation of immense pressure, as if my skull were a fragile shell about to crack. It was here. It was now. The green expanded, not into a defined shape, but into a vast, shimmering curtain of light that seemed to stretch from the unseen water to the unseen sky. They were too numerous to count, too complex to comprehend, shifting and reforming with an impossible geometry that defied all earthly laws of perspective. The familiar lines of the cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running, began to soften, to blur, the metal seeming to ripple like disturbed water. A low, collective murmur began to rise from the depths of the green light. It wasn't a language, not in any sense I understood, but a chorus of vast, ancient presences. It was the sound of thoughts too immense for human minds to contain, the echoes of truths too terrible to grasp. I felt a profound shift within me, a dissolving of boundaries. My own thoughts no longer felt distinctly mine. They were fragments, echoes of that terrible chorus, swirling with an indifferent, ancient wisdom. My body felt distant, a vessel, no longer truly anchored to me. The green light pulsed one final, colossal time, and then, with a soundless implosion, it was gone. The fog remained, thicker now, impenetrable. But it wasn't the same fog. It was alive, a living shroud that pulsed with the faint, residual green light, a vast, breathing entity. The cargo ship adrift in fog, crew gone, engines running, was no longer a ship on an ocean. It was a single, tiny, insignificant speck, floating on the surface of something else entirely, something vast and utterly alien. They were shared, absorbed into the immense, indifferent awareness that now permeated everything. What had become of the ocean and of me?